I was the ghost at my family's table, the one they forgot to feed, the one they planned to sell. But when my brother burned the world down, I was the only thing left in the ashes. Now, the most dangerous man in the city is looking at me like I'm the only meal he's ever wanted. The night I stopped being invisible started with the sound of my brother destroying everything our family pretended to be. I'm standing in the cold, dim kitchen of the Han family estate scrubbing dishes from a celebration I wasn't invited to attend, listening to the muffled sounds of my parents and their business associates toasting successes that have nothing to do with the second son they keep hidden in the back rooms like a shameful secret. The news of Jiaite's betrayal breaks like a thunderclap through the expensive sound system my father installed to feel important. Emergency broadcasts cutting through the classical music and champagne laughter, with reports that my older brother has just leaked classified information belonging to Kang Yeon, the Enigma Mafia lord whose name makes grown men check over their shoulders even in daylight. The muffled celebration in the dining room transforms into panicked shouting within seconds, and I hear my father barking orders about escape routes and offshore accounts while my mother is already calling their private pilot. But none of them are thinking about the invisible son standing in the kitchen with dish soap still on his hands because Han Soo-jin has never been worth remembering when things get complicated. The front gates explode inward with enough force that I feel the vibration through the marble floors, and suddenly the house that's been my prison for 26 years is filling with the kind of silence that comes right before violence. The expensive grandfather clock in the hallway marking seconds that feel like they're counting down to something irreversible. Kang Yeon enters through the shattered doorway like he's walking into a place that already belongs to him, moving with the kind of minimalist, lethal authority that makes every gesture feel calculated and final. And even from the kitchen where I'm frozen with my back pressed against the sink, I can smell the Enigma scent rolling off him in waves that make my hindbrain scream warnings about predators who don't need to chase because everything in their territory is already caught. My parents are on their knees in the foyer begging for mercy with the same voices they used to toast their success 5 minutes ago, offering money and information and anything else they think might buy them time to escape. But Yeon's eyes sweep past them like they're furniture that came with the house and land directly on me standing in the shadows of the kitchen doorway. He doesn't want their money or their apologies or their pathetic attempts to negotiate consequences for crimes they helped enable even if they claim they didn't know what Jiaite was planning. He walks past my sobbing mother and my father's desperate offers like they're not even speaking human language, and when he stops in front of me I realize that for the first time in 26 years of being the ghost at my family's table, I'm the center of a storm I didn't create and can't escape, and the most dangerous man in the city is looking at me like I'm not disposable at all but rather the only thing in this entire estate worth taking. Before I tell you how I went from forgotten son to captive obsession, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next changed everything about who I thought I was and what I believed I was worth. The drive to Kang Yeon's estate happens in silence so complete that I can hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, and I spend the entire 20-minute journey pressed against the far door of the luxury vehicle trying to make myself invisible through sheer force of habit, even though I'm acutely aware that his attention hasn't shifted away from me since he walked past my begging parents like they were obstacles rather than people who'd spent decades convincing themselves they were important. Im Woo-jin is waiting when we arrive at the compound, a man whose face suggests he's seen enough violence to be permanently unimpressed by human suffering, and he processes me into the estate's security system with the kind of clinical efficiency that makes it clear I'm not the first captive to be registered into whatever digital prison Yeon has constructed. My fingerprints and retinal patterns are scanned into biometric locks that apparently control every door in this minimalist fortress. And when Woo-jin explains that the system tracks my location at all times, I realize that the invisible son who spent 26 years being forgotten by his own family is about to spend however long Yeon decides in a place where every breath I take is monitored and recorded. The room they assign me is sterile in its perfection. All white walls and furniture arranged with geometric precision that makes the space feel more like a high-end medical facility than living quarters. And there's a camera in the upper corner that Woo-jin doesn't bother to hide or apologize for when he notices me staring at the red recording light. He tells me that meals will be delivered at specific times, that I'm not to leave this wing without escort, and that any attempt to contact the outside world will result in consequences. He describes with enough casual menace that I understand he's not making threats but rather stating facts about how this captivity is going to function regardless of whether I cooperate or resist. The scale of Jiaite's treachery gets explained to me over the course of that first evening through a tablet Woo-jin leaves on the minimalist desk, Detailed files showing that my brother didn't just leak classified information but actually sold operational intelligence that resulted in the deaths of 7 of Yeon's people during what should have been a routine transaction with a weapons supplier. The betrayal wasn't a momentary lapse or a desperate mistake, but rather a calculated transaction where Gi-tae took payment from a rival organization to compromise Yeon's entire Eastern distribution network. And the fact that my family helped launder the blood money through their legitimate business accounts means that every Han who touched those funds is complicit in murders that Kang Yeon has apparently decided require payment in suffering rather than simple execution. I'm the payment, Woo Jin explains with the same emotional detachment he might use to discuss inventory management, because executing my family would be quick and therefore inadequate retribution for betrayal that cost 7 lives and millions in compromised operations. Keeping me alive and captive where Gi-tae can know his abandoned little brother is suffering the consequences of crimes he committed creates a much more satisfying form of revenge. A living reminder that the Han family's attempt to play power games with an Enigma Mafia lord has resulted in exactly the kind of permanent consequences that their money and connections can't negotiate away. The realization that I'm not here because Yeon wants anything from me personally but rather because my existence serves as ongoing punishment for my brother's crimes should make me feel disposable and insignificant. But instead I find myself noticing the way the camera in my room adjusts its angle slightly every time I move, the lens tracking my position with the kind of attention that feels less like surveillance and more like someone is actually watching rather than just recording. I test the theory by walking to the window and looking out at the compound's exterior lighting, and the camera follows the movement with enough precision that I can feel the weight of a gaze that's focused entirely on me even though the person behind the lens is somewhere else in this sterile fortress. That night I discover something that changes my understanding of this captivity when I'm brought dinner by a staff member who's clearly uncomfortable entering my room. A young man who sets the tray on the desk and leaves so quickly, he almost trips over his own feet in his rush to get back through the door. I ask Woo Jin about it the next morning when he comes to check that I haven't done anything stupid like try to break the unbreakable windows, and he gives me a look that suggests I've stumbled onto information that wasn't supposed to be revealed this early in my captivity. The private wing where Yeon lives has never been accessed by another living soul. He finally says, not staff or associates or anyone else who works in this compound, because the Enigma who owns this empire has spent his entire adult life maintaining absolute physical isolation from every person who serves him. The revelation that Yeon lives in complete isolation sits in my mind like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit the image of a ruthless mafia lord who supposedly controls half the city's underground operations, and I spend the next 3 days confined to my sterile room trying to reconcile the man who took me as human payment with someone who apparently can't tolerate physical proximity to anyone in his organization. The garden confrontation happens on the 4th morning when Woo Jin escorts me outside for what he calls mandatory exercise in a courtyard that's as geometrically perfect as the rest of this minimalist fortress. All precisely trimmed hedges and gravel paths arranged in patterns that probably mean something to whoever designed this space with the same clinical precision that characterizes every other aspect of Yeon's estate. I'm walking the perimeter with Woo Jin trailing at his regulation 3 meters behind when I see Kang Yeon standing near the fountain at the garden's center. And my first instinct is to turn around and retreat to my room because nothing good can come from being this close to the man who's keeping me captive as ongoing punishment for my brother's crimes. But Yeon's already seen me. And when he gestures for Woo Jin to leave us alone, I feel my pulse spike with the kind of fear that comes from understanding that whatever happens next is going to hurt, and there's absolutely nothing I can do to prevent or escape it. I walk toward him with mechanical steps that feel like approaching an execution, my mind running through all the ways an Enigma could punish an Omega without technically violating whatever rules govern this captivity. And by the time I'm standing 3 feet away from him in the shadow of the fountain, I'm braced for violence or humiliation or some combination of both that will remind me exactly how disposable I am despite the attention his surveillance cameras pay to my every movement. What happens instead is that Yeon's scent hits me with enough force to make my knees actually buckle, the Enigma pheromones rolling off him in waves that are nothing like the distant pressure I felt during the car ride from my family's estate, but rather something immediate and overwhelming that makes every nerve ending in my body light up with signals I don't know how to interpret. The scent is alpine and clean with an undertone of something darker that my hindbrain recognizes as dangerous even while my Omega biology is responding with interest that feels like betrayal of my own survival instincts. And I watch Yeon's expression shift from controlled authority to something that looks almost like physical pain as he takes a step back and puts more distance between us like my proximity is causing him actual discomfort. The fear I've been carrying since he took me from my family's estate transforms into something confusing and electric when I realize that the most dangerous man in the city is physically shaken by being this close to me. His hands clenching at his sides like he's fighting the urge to either push me away or pull me closer and can't decide which impulse is more dangerous to act on. We stand there in the perfectly maintained garden for what feels like an eternity but is probably less than a minute. Neither of us speaking while the tension between us builds into something that has nothing to do with punishment or revenge and everything to do with biology that's apparently stronger than whatever isolation Yeon has been maintaining for reasons I don't understand yet. He dismisses me without a word, turning and walking back toward the private wing that no one else is allowed to enter, and I'm left standing by the fountain trying to process what just happened and why the Enigma who's supposed to be keeping me captive as leverage against my brother looked at me like I was something terrifying and irresistible in equal measure. That evening I find a medical file that someone left on my desk, whether by accident or deliberate design I can't tell, and the clinical language inside describes a condition I've never heard of before, a biological anomaly where an Enigma system rejects physical contact with everyone except a genetically compatible mate, maintaining complete isolation for years or even decades until the right match triggers a response that's apparently so overwhelming it can be physically dangerous for both parties involved. The medical file sits on my desk for 2 days before I work up the courage to actually read it properly, and when I finally do I realize that the clinical language is describing Kang Yeon's condition with the kind of detached precision that makes something extraordinary sound like a manageable inconvenience rather than a biological prison that's kept him isolated from every person in his organization for his entire adult life. The terminology talks about extreme tactile rejection and genetic compatibility thresholds and catastrophic biological response to unsuitable contact. But what it actually means is that the Enigma who controls half the city's criminal operations has never been able to tolerate being touched by another human being without his body treating the contact like a physical attack that needs to be violently rejected. The biological flare hits me on the 6th night of my captivity without any warning beyond a sudden spike in my body temperature that makes the sterile white room feel suffocatingly hot. And I realize with distant horror that I'm going into a heat cycle despite the suppressants I've been taking religiously since I presented as an Omega at 16 because my family made it very clear that the embarrassment of an uncontrolled heat was something they wouldn't tolerate from the sun they were already ashamed to acknowledge. The suppressants should have prevented this for at least another 2 months, but apparently my Omega biology has decided that being in close proximity to an unmated Enigma whose scent makes every instinct I possess light up like warning flares is enough of a trigger to override whatever chemical barriers I've been maintaining between my presentation and my actual biological responses. I can feel the security camera in my room tracking my movements as I pace between the bed and the window trying to manage symptoms that are rapidly escalating from uncomfortable to unbearable. And I know that wherever Yeon is in this minimalist fortress, he's watching me deteriorate into a biological state that's going to make the tense encounter in the garden look like polite distance by comparison. The door to my room opens without my permission approximately 30 minutes into the flare, and Kang Yeon enters with Woojin trailing behind carrying what looks like medical supplies. But the moment Yeon crosses the threshold into the space where my heat scent is concentrated he stops moving like he's hit a physical wall. The transformation in his expression from controlled authority to something raw and desperate happens so fast that I actually take a step back despite the fact that my Omega instincts are screaming at me to move closer to the source of that alpine and darkness scent that's suddenly flooding the room with enough intensity to make me dizzy. Woojin backs out of the room with the medical supplies still in his hands, pulling the door closed behind him, and suddenly I'm alone with an Enigma whose repressed instincts are apparently being triggered by my heat in ways that the clinical medical file didn't adequately prepare me for. Yeon tells me with a voice that sounds like it's being forced through clenched teeth that he's never been with anyone, that his condition has made it impossible for him to tolerate the kind of proximity that normal relationships require, that he spent 42 years believing he was fundamentally broken in ways that meant he would die alone in whatever sterile fortress he built to keep the world at a safe distance from his rejection-prone biology. But standing in my room while I'm in heat apparently overrides every defense mechanism his body has spent decades constructing, and I watch him struggle with the realization that I'm not triggering his catastrophic rejection response but rather the opposite, that his Enigma instincts are recognizing me as the genetic compatibility his system has been waiting for since he first understood that everyone else's touch felt like violence. The shocking revelation that I'm the only key that fits Yeon's locked-away desires should probably terrify me given that I'm his captive and he's the man who took me as payment for my brother's crimes. but instead I find myself moving closer to him despite every rational thought in my head screaming that this is dangerous and complicated and absolutely not something I should be encouraging while I'm biologically compromised. The obsession I've been feeling through the surveillance cameras apparently wasn't just about punishment or revenge, but rather about an enigma who's been watching the first person he's ever been able to tolerate with the kind of desperate focus that comes from 42 years of isolation finally encountering something that doesn't make his body treat proximity like an attack. He leaves my room before either of us does something irreversible, but the fierce protection I feel radiating from him as he pulls the door closed is so intense it's almost physical, and I realize that whatever clinical observation he's been maintaining through security feeds has just transformed into something far more dangerous for both of us. The heat cycle breaks after 3 days of biological agony that Yeon manages from a distance through carefully calibrated medication that Woo Jin delivers with the same clinical efficiency he brings to every other aspect of maintaining this sterile fortress, and when I finally emerge from the haze of hormones and overwhelming instinct, I find that the dynamic between my captor and me has shifted into something that feels less like punishment and more like protection, even though I can't quite articulate what exactly has changed beyond the fact that the surveillance camera in my room now feels less like monitoring and more like someone standing guard. The news about Ji-tae reaches the estate on the 8th day of my captivity through whatever intelligence network Yeon maintains to track threats to his operations, and Woo Jin delivers the information with the kind of grim satisfaction that suggests he's been waiting for my brother to make exactly this kind of stupid move. Ji-tae isn't hiding in whatever offshore sanctuary our parents fled to, but rather actively hunting for me with the kind of desperate determination that comes from understanding that as long as I'm alive and in Yeon's custody, I represent living evidence of the Han family's betrayal. A permanent reminder that my brother's crimes resulted in consequences that money and connections can't negotiate away. The revelation that my own family wants me dead shouldn't hurt as much as it does, given that they spent 26 years treating me like I was disposable. But there's something uniquely devastating about learning that Ji-tae isn't content to let me suffer captivity as punishment for his crimes, but rather wants to erase me entirely, so that he can pretend the debt of blood his betrayal created doesn't exist anymore. Yeon finds me in the garden where we had our first tense encounter, and when he sits on the bench beside me without the careful distance he's been maintaining since my heat cycle ended, I realize that whatever isolation his condition requires has apparently been overridden by the fact that I'm the genetic compatibility his system has been waiting for through 42 years of untouched existence. He tells me that he isn't keeping me captive to hurt me, but rather to keep me from being erased by a family that views my continued existence as inconvenient evidence of their complicity in crimes that cost 7 lives and compromised an entire distribution network. The debt of blood that Ji-tae owes can't be paid if the leverage Yeon is holding gets eliminated by the same people who created the debt in the first place, which means that protecting me from my brother's assassination attempts is actually more important to Yeon's revenge than any suffering my captivity might be causing me. The explanation should make me feel like a valuable asset being protected for strategic purposes rather than personal reasons. But the way Yeon's hand moves to rest on the bench between us with his fingers almost but not quite touching mine suggests that whatever started as revenge has evolved into something far more complicated and dangerous for both of us. The terrifying sense of belonging that floods through me when I realize that Kang Yeon is the first person in my entire life who's decided that keeping Han Soo-jin alive is worth the effort and resources required to defend against threats, including my own blood family, is so overwhelming that I actually have to close my eyes against the intensity of it. I've spent 26 years being the ghost at my family's table, the son they forgot to feed and planned to sell, and now the most dangerous man in the city is telling me that my life has value not because of what I can provide or how useful I am, but rather because losing me would be unacceptable to an enigma whose biology has finally found the one person it doesn't reject. The dinner where Yeon claims me happens 3 days later in the formal dining room I didn't know existed in this minimalist fortress. And when I walk in to find the table set for 8 people, including several of his high-ranking associates, I realize that whatever privacy we've been maintaining is about to be shattered by a very public declaration that's going to change my status from hidden captive to acknowledged partner in ways that I'm not sure I'm ready to navigate. The dinner where Yeon claims me in front of his associates is a carefully orchestrated performance where he seats me at his right hand in the position that traditionally belongs to a consort rather than a captive. And the way his people avoid making direct eye contact with me suggests they understand exactly what message is being communicated by the Enigma, who's never allowed anyone into his personal space, suddenly treating an Omega like he's something precious rather than disposable. The assassination attempt happened 60 hours later in the one place I thought was actually safe. My sterile white room where the security camera has been tracking my every movement since Wu Jin first processed me into this minimalist fortress. I wake up to the sensation of a hand covering my mouth and the cold press of a blade against my throat. And in the dim light from the surveillance camera's recording indicator, I can see the face of someone I vaguely recognize from my family's estate. One of the household staff who apparently decided that Jiaite's bounty on my head was worth more than whatever loyalty they might have felt toward the Han family's forgotten second son. The attack lasts less than 30 seconds before the door to my room explodes inward with enough force to tear it off its reinforced hinges, and Kang Yeon enters like a natural disaster given human form, moving with the kind of lethal precision that makes it very clear why he's managed to control half the city's criminal operations despite being biologically unable to tolerate proximity to the people who work for him. The would-be assassin doesn't even have time to process what's happening before Yeon has disarmed him and broken both his arms with moves that are so efficient they look almost casual. And the absolute obsessive power radiating from the Enigma who's just brutally defended his genetic compatibility makes something in my chest tighten with emotions I don't know how to name. The display of violence should terrify me given that I'm watching a man systematically destroy another human being with his bare hands in my bedroom, while I'm still bleeding from the shallow cut the assassin's blade left across my throat. But instead I find myself mesmerized by the way Yeon's control never actually breaks even while he's delivering what's clearly meant to be a permanent message about the consequences of touching something that belongs to him. He has Wu Jin remove the broken assassin with instructions that are delivered in a voice so cold it makes the sterile white room feel even more like a high-security medical facility. And then he's kneeling beside my bed checking the wound on my throat with hands that are somehow gentle despite the violence they just inflicted. The glass prison I've been living in for the past 2 weeks shivers with the understanding that the safe walls of this estate weren't actually impenetrable, and that Jiaite's desperation to erase me is apparently strong enough to corrupt people within Yeon's own organization. And I watch the Enigma who's supposed to maintain absolute isolation make a decision that breaks every rule his condition has required him to follow for 42 years. He doesn't leave my room after the medical team finishes treating the cut on my throat, doesn't retreat to the private wing that no one else has ever been allowed to enter, but rather settles himself on the floor outside my door with his back against the wall like he's planning to physically guard the threshold between me and whatever other threats might be lurking in the compound he thought was secure. I can see him through the gap where the door used to hang before he tore it off its hinges, and the sight of the most dangerous man in the city sitting on the floor outside my room because his biology has apparently decided that protecting me is more important than maintaining the isolation that's kept him untouched for his entire adult life makes me realize that whatever captivity this started as has transformed into something far more complicated and intense than either of us probably intended. I invite him inside sometime around 3 in the morning when I can't sleep because the adrenaline from the attack is still making my heart race, and the knowledge that Jiaite managed to get an assassin past Yeon's security makes the sterile white walls feel less like protection and more like a target painted on my back. And when Yeon actually crosses the threshold into my room rather than maintaining his position as guardian of the doorway, I understand that we're about to break the final barrier between captor and captive and step into territory that's going to change everything about what we are to each other. Yeon enters my room with the kind of careful deliberation that suggests he's fighting every instinct his condition has trained him to follow for 42 years. And when he sits on the edge of my bed with enough distance that we're not quite touching, I realize that the Enigma who just destroyed an assassin with his bare hands is actually uncertain about how to navigate proximity that isn't violent or clinical. I've spent 26 years being invisible and disposable, treated like something that takes up space without providing value. But the way Yeon is looking at me now has nothing to do with captivity or revenge and everything to do with a man who's finally encountered the genetic compatibility his biology has been searching for through decades of isolation that must have felt like a prison sentence with no possibility of parole. I offer myself to him with words that come out steadier than I expected given that I'm propositioning the most dangerous man in the city, while sitting in a bedroom that still smells like violence from the assassination attempt 3 hours ago. And I watch something shift in his expression from uncertainty to a hunger that's been locked away for so long it's almost overwhelming in its intensity when it finally gets released. Teaching the Virgin King how to claim his Omega becomes a strange reversal of every power dynamic that's defined our relationship since he took me from my family's estate. Because suddenly I'm the one with knowledge and experience while he's learning how to touch another person without his body treating the contact like an attack that needs to be violently rejected. The permanent bond forms sometime between the first touch that doesn't trigger his catastrophic rejection response and the moment when his teeth break the skin at the junction of my neck and shoulder, the biological seal that marks me as his in ways that can't be negotiated or dissolved regardless of what external circumstances might try to separate us. I can feel the bond settling into place like a new sense I didn't know I was missing. A connection that lets me feel his emotions as clearly as I feel my own heartbeat. And the overwhelming relief and possessive satisfaction radiating through the link suggests that Yeon has been waiting his entire adult life for this exact moment, even if he didn't consciously understand what he was searching for. The emotional shift from pawn to partner happens so gradually that I don't realize it's occurring until I'm lying in his arms watching dawn light filter through the windows of the room that used to feel like a sterile cage but now feels like the safest place in a world where my own brother is actively trying to erase me. The man who took me as payment for crimes I didn't commit is holding me like I'm something infinitely precious rather than a strategic asset, and the bond humming between us makes it impossible to pretend that this captivity is still about revenge when it's clearly evolved into something far more dangerous and permanent than either of us probably intended when this started. The alarms that shatter the peaceful morning are the kind that indicate perimeter breach rather than internal threat. And through the bond one can feel Yeon's instant shift from sated contentment to lethal focus as he processes the tactical information flooding through whatever security system monitors the fortress walls. Jiaite's forces are launching a final desperate siege on the high-tech compound, apparently deciding that if they can't get an assassin past Yeon's internal security, then overwhelming force applied to the external defenses might be enough to breach the walls and eliminate the leverage that's preventing my brother from pretending his betrayal never had consequences that need to be paid in blood. The estate plunges into complete darkness within seconds of the perimeter alarms triggering, and through the bond one can feel Yeon's cold fury at the realization that Jiaite's assault isn't just physical force applied to the external walls but also includes hackers who've managed to breach the security systems that were supposed to make this minimalist fortress impenetrable to exactly this kind of coordinated attack. The backup generators should have activated immediately when the main power failed, but the fact that we're still sitting in absolute darkness suggests that whatever team my brother hired to compromise the compound's defenses knew exactly which systems to target to create maximum chaos and vulnerability. I tell Yeon through the bond before I consciously articulate the words that Jiaite always approaches problems by identifying the single point of failure that holds an entire structure together, that my brother spent our childhood taking apart complex systems just to understand which component was essential to the whole mechanism continuing to function, and that the power grid and backup generators are probably just the beginning of a cascade failure designed to strip away every defensive layer, until there's nothing left protecting the leverage he's desperate to eliminate. Through the darkness I can hear Yeon moving with the kind of lethal precision that doesn't require sight, and I follow him out of my room and down corridors I've only traveled during daylight with Woo Jin's escort, trusting the bond to guide me toward wherever the Enigma is leading us through his compromised fortress. The emergency command center that Yeon brings me to is running on isolated power that apparently wasn't connected to the systems Jiaite's hackers compromised. And in the dim glow of backup monitors I can see Woo Jin coordinating defensive positions with the kind of grim efficiency that suggests this isn't the first siege he's helped Yeon survive. I'm studying the tactical displays showing where my brother's forces are concentrating their assault when I notice something in the attack pattern that makes my stomach drop with the sick understanding that Jiaite isn't actually trying to breach the fortress walls but rather herding Yeon's defenders into specific positions that leave particular sections of the compound vulnerable to infiltration. The knowledge of my brother's tactics that I'm providing through increasingly desperate explanations to Yeon and Woo Jin apparently comes from somewhere deeper than just growing up in the same household as someone who liked taking things apart to understand how they worked. And when Woo Jin pulls up the classified files that Jiaite originally leaked to trigger this entire catastrophe, I discover that the secret my brother betrayed wasn't just operational intelligence about Yeon's distribution network but rather detailed documentation about Han Soo-jin's hidden potential as a strategic analyst whose pattern recognition abilities are apparently rare enough that multiple organizations have been tracking me since I was a teenager, even though my own family treated me like I was too disposable to be worth their attention. The revelation that I've been valuable this entire time in ways my family deliberately ignored because acknowledging my abilities would have complicated their plans to use me as a bargaining chip in whatever schemes they were running makes the 26 years of invisibility feel even more like a calculated erasure rather than simple neglect. Jiaite leaked information about my potential to multiple rival organizations as part of his betrayal of Yeon, which means that the siege currently threatening this fortress isn't just about eliminating leverage but rather about preventing those rivals from acquiring an asset that my brother apparently decided was more valuable sold to enemies than kept within the family that spent decades pretending I didn't exist. The monitors tracking the assault suddenly show a breach in the eastern wall that I predicted 3 minutes ago based on the pattern of feints and probing attacks, and through the security feeds I can see my brother walking through the gap his forces created with the kind of arrogant certainty that suggests he believes this confrontation is already won. The face-to-face showdown between Sujin and Jiaite is apparently going to happen in the command center where I'm standing beside the Enigma who claimed me as a partner rather than keeping me as a pawn. And I realize that whatever happens in the next few minutes is going to permanently sever whatever remains of the blood connection between me and the family that planned to sell me before my brother burned their world down and made me valuable enough to be worth stealing. Jiaite walks into the command center with the kind of confidence that comes from believing he's already won this confrontation, and the sight of my older brother wearing tactical gear like he's some kind of elite operative rather than the spoiled heir who spent our childhood taking things apart for entertainment makes me realize how completely I've been underestimating the scope of his betrayal. He stops when he sees me standing beside Yun instead of cowering in whatever corner he expected to find me hiding in, and the flicker of genuine surprise that crosses his face suggests that the disposable little brother he planned to erase has apparently evolved into something he wasn't anticipating having to navigate. The confrontation that follows strips away whatever illusions I might have been maintaining about blood meaning anything more than shared genetics, because Jiaite explains with the kind of casual cruelty that suggests he's been waiting years to deliver this particular truth that he never loved me or even liked me but rather viewed me as a useful asset that could be deployed when the family needed leverage or bargaining power with organizations that valued strategic analysts more than the Hans valued their second son. The 26 years of invisibility weren't neglect but rather deliberate conditioning designed to keep me dependent and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they chose to provide, and the fact that I was supposed to be sold to one of their business partners before Jiaite's betrayal disrupted those plans makes the phantom weight of being the ghost at my family's table transform into something closer to rage at the systematic erasure I've been subjected to by people who were supposed to protect me. I tell my brother with a voice that sounds steadier than I expected that he made a catastrophic miscalculation when he assumed that the disposable little brother he planned to erase would still be a helpless captive rather than the bonded partner of an Enigma whose obsessive protection has given me more value and agency in 3 weeks than 26 years of being a Han ever provided. Through the bond one can feel Yun preparing to deliver whatever final blow will permanently eliminate the threat my brother represents. But I step forward before the Enigma can move and make it very clear that this particular severing needs to be executed by the person who survived being treated like he was worthless rather than being rescued by someone else's violence. The reclaiming of my own power happens when I tell Jiaite exactly how his assault on the fortress was going to fail because I've spent the past hour using the strategic analysis abilities he leaked to rival organizations to systematically dismantle every tactic he deployed, and watching my brother's confidence shatter into the understanding that the asset he planned to sell has apparently become more valuable and dangerous than he ever anticipated is almost as satisfying as the moment when Yun's security forces flood the command center and take him into custody with the kind of efficient brutality that makes it clear this isn't going to end with a negotiated surrender. The total liberation from my discarded past settles into my chest like breathing clean air for the first time after spending decades in a room with insufficient ventilation, and I watch Jiaite being dragged away to whatever punishment Yun has planned for people who orchestrate sieges on his compound while I stand beside the Enigma who claimed me as a partner rather than keeping me as a pawn. The blood connection that was supposed to mean something has been permanently severed by the brother who never loved me anyway, and the freedom that comes from understanding I don't owe loyalty to people who spent 26 years treating me like I was disposable is more intoxicating than any revenge could ever be. The aftermath of the siege reveals itself slowly over the following days, as Yun's intelligence network confirms that multiple rival organizations received the leaked information about my strategic analysis potential and are now requesting meetings with the Enigma's newly acknowledged partner, and the new status I apparently hold in the Mafia world is something that even Yun's long-established associates are struggling to process because bonded consorts don't usually transition from captive leverage to legitimate power broker in less than a month. The rebuilding of the estate happens over the course of 3 months, and I watch Yun's minimalist fortress transform from a clinical prison designed for isolation into something that actually feels like a home built for 2 people who've spent their entire lives believing they were fundamentally incompatible with the world around them. The sterile white walls of my former captivity get replaced with colors and textures that Yun asks my opinion about with the kind of genuine interest that suggests he's never had to consider what another person might want from a shared living space. And the cameras that used to track my every movement get repositioned to function as actual security rather than surveillance of someone who might try to escape. The management of Yun's empire becomes a partnership where my strategic analysis abilities that Jiaite leaked to half the criminal underworld get deployed in ways that actually serve the organization I'm now part of rather than being sold to the highest bidder by a family that viewed me as a disposable asset. I sit in on meetings with Yeon's high-ranking associates and provide the kind of tactical insight that apparently justifies whatever concerns they initially had about their Enigma boss bonding with someone who started as leverage for his brother's crimes, and the respect I'm receiving from people who control significant portions of the city's underground operations is so different from 26 years of invisibility that I sometimes still expect to wake up back in the cold, dim kitchen of the Han family estate cleaning up after celebrations I wasn't invited to attend. The rival organizations that receive GIT's leaked information about my potential send increasingly desperate requests for meetings that Yeon and I handle with the kind of coordinated efficiency that comes from being able to feel each other's tactical decisions through a bond that makes us more effective together than either of us could be operating separately. We're not just refusing their offers to poach me away from Yeon's organization, but rather making it very clear that the strategic analyst they were hoping to acquire comes as a package deal with an Enigma whose obsessive protection means that anyone trying to separate us is going to face consequences that make my brother's current imprisonment look merciful by comparison. The final resolution of my transformation from outcast to the heartbeat of Yeon's world happens so gradually that I don't realize it's complete until I'm standing in our rebuilt home, watching the sun set over a city where I'm no longer invisible or disposable, but rather someone whose continued well-being is apparently important enough that multiple criminal organizations have restructured their operations around the reality of my existence. The bond humming between Yeon and me carries his absolute certainty that finding his genetic compatibility after 42 years of isolation was worth every moment of believing he was fundamentally broken. And through our connection I can feel that he views me not as a prize he won or an asset he acquired, but rather as the person who made him understand that untouched doesn't mean unworthy, and that sometimes the things we believe make us incompatible with the world are actually just incompatibility with the wrong people. I was the ghost at my family's table for 26 years, the son they forgot to feed and planned to sell. But the most dangerous man in the city looked at me like I was the only meal he'd ever wanted, and that obsessive attention from the right person turned out to be exactly what I needed to finally be truly seen. The phantom weight of invisibility that used to feel like it was crushing me has been replaced by the permanent bond mark on my neck, and the understanding that being treasured by an Enigma who spent 42 years in isolation means being valued in ways that normal relationships can't replicate. And the ghost who used to haunt the Han family estate has found a home in the arms of someone who sees me not despite my perceived worthlessness, but rather understands that what my family called disposable was actually the rarest kind of compatibility his biology had been searching for through decades of rejection and loneliness. To be obsessed over by the right person, I've learned, is to finally be truly seen, and the captivity that started as punishment for my brother's crimes transformed into the first place I've ever felt like I actually belonged. And that's how the ghost at my family's table became the heartbeat of an empire. If this story of captivity, obsession, and finding worth in the most unexpected place resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories about people who discover they were never disposable after all, and tell me in the comments. Would you have trusted the Enigma's obsession, or would you have fought to stay invisible? I'd love to hear your thoughts.